Hello everyone, today we are exploring the Unity Graphics Compositor from start to finish. So let's dive in. I am working with Unity 2023. We are using the 3D high-end HDRP template, that is the high definition render pipeline. I've titled my project Graphics Compositor Walkthrough. You can name your project whatever you like. So give your project a name, click create, and I will see you inside. Here we are in the actual project. It has opened, it is loaded, and here we are greeted with the HDRP wizard itself. If you have it ticked show on start, you will see this every time you start up a project. If you untick it, of course, you will not. Doesn't bother me, so I'll leave it right there. I will click it away though because we don't need it. First steps first. Let's organize our project. You're looking at a blank project. I'm looking at a blank project. Let's right click in the asset project folder and choose create folder. I'm going to name a new folder underscore movies. The reason for underscore is so that the movies folder will be placed at the top of the list. I'm also going to create a folder for scenes because we're going to create a new scene and we already have a scene, so why not put them together in a folder? Right click in project, create folder. I'll name this underscore scenes. And I'll just drag outdoor scene into that folder. Beautiful. Now, if we are going to work with the Graphics Compositor and we are going to utilize pre-existing, pre-recorded video footage, we're going to need some pre-recorded footage in our project. It just so happens I have some on my computer. I'm going to simply drag and drop it into the project folder. So I'm going to choose Dinosaur Roar, drag it right into movies. Now, before we work with the Graphics Compositor, there are two configurations we need to make to the Unity engine. And lucky for us, we can find them in nearly the same place. Under Edit, scroll down to Project Settings, and I want you to find Quality HDRP. Scroll down until you see Post-Processing. You'll see Grading Lookup Table Format and Buffer Format. I want you to change Buffer Format to the second option ending in 1.6. The second thing we will be doing is under Graphics, HDRP Global Settings. I want you to scroll down, scroll all the way down until you see Before Post Process. We are going to click the plus icon and we are going to add alpha injection. We are also going to click the plus icon a second time and add chroma keying. We're done! My bird says hello, by the way. This is a quick break to let you know that this video is sponsored by my bird. He says hi. He wants you to say hi. That's all he wants from you. We're done with project settings. Let's close it out. It does occur to me that my layout of windows within the Unity editor look different than your own. This is nothing that either of us has done wrong. I simply have a lot of layouts. I'm going to switch to the default now so that I might better match what you're seeing on your own screen. Let's start things off with the Graphics Compositor. Do so under Window, Rendering, Graphics Compositor. Depending on the Unity version you are utilizing, rendering list item may appear in a different position within the list beneath the Windows menu. But as long as you find rendering, you will find Graphics Compositor. Click that to open. I typically have my Graphics Compositor on a separate external display, but so that we can see everything together, I'm going to place mine right in here. along with the scene and game windows. So how do we begin? Where do we begin? It's pretty simple. Let's click on Enable Compositor. With the Graphics Compositor enabled, things might look a little intimidating, but I don't want you to worry because I'm going to hold your hand through every step of the process. So here we are. We can see that we have a default base layer and we have the content of our base layer. Layers operate in a very similar way to Photoshop. However, the way we create a new layer is much more complicated and hands-on. It's not simply a matter of clicking Add New Layer. So let's start that process right now. To create a new layer, we want to find our composition graph. If we click on the composition graph that is currently slotted in, it will be highlighted within our project folder. Double-clicking the composition graph from project folder will open up our default composition graph. Right off the bat, everything looks very crowded. We would definitely like to have more working room. So if you double-click on the tab for default composition graph, it will open up in full screen. This is also true for everything else. For the Graphics Compositor, if I hit Save first, it will then open up. Same for Game Window, double-clicking, full screen, double-click to return to the workspace. Same for Scene Window, so we can just double-click and return back. So here we are in the default composition graph, and I've opened it up full screen. Before we modify anything, let me explain exactly it is what we are looking at. That way we don't get lost further down the trail. You can see that our graph is currently made up of the output of our graph, and then we have this node set. I call it a set because this is one node, this is a second, and they operate together. You can see that they're connected as one is the input for the other. Placing the mouse over the base layer in this inspector highlights the base layer node in the composition graph. The reverse is true. Hovering over the node inside of the composition graph highlights it in the inspector. Let's take note of the name, base layer. Where have we seen that before? If we switch over to the Graphics Compositor, we can see that our layer is named base layer. These are one and the same. Base layer here in our our Graphics Compositor is the representation of the base layer here in our composition graph. To work with a traditional composite, we might be thinking of background and foreground, and in a more complicated, advanced composite, we might be working with background, midground, foreground. So let's start things off by simply renaming base layer by double-clicking and renaming it to background. Perfect. I am also going to hover my mouse over the connection between our background and the output, because we want more than simply the background itself. So I then right-click and delete. Here in the inspector for default composition graph, let's click on the plus icon and type Texture 2D. Select Texture 2D, and I'm going to give it the name of midground. Okay. I'm now going to drag midground into the composition graph, and I'm going to set it up by right-clicking in an empty space, choosing Create Node, and searching for Sample Texture 2D. Here it is. Double-click to open. And I'm just going to close this bottom display because we don't currently need it visible, and I want it to look exactly like this for the simplicity of this tutorial. So let's connect midground to the Sample Texture 2D. Think of the midground 2D node as the input as a texture or the contents that we wish to display. The Sample Texture 2D node is the means by which we collect the contents of this midground node. So here's the content, and we want to display it via this Texture T2 input. Beautiful. So now let's mix the background and the foreground, midground, and send them both to the output. We do that by right-clicking in an empty space, clicking on Create Node, and typing LERP, L-E-R-P. I'm going to give myself more working space by collecting these nodes and moving them over just a bit. So from the background, I'll collect the RGBA output and connect it to the A input of the LERP. Think of LERP as a mix node. I'm now going to grab the RGBA of the midground. I'm going to connect it to the B input. And now I'm going to grab the alpha channel of the midground and connect it to the transparency of the LERP. This allows, so we have background in A, midground in B, and in order for the transparent space within the midground texture to display what's behind it, we've connected its alpha channel to the transparency. If we were only working with background and foreground, and we didn't have any other layers we wanted to work with, we could simply connect the output to the base output and call it a day. But we're going to go one step further, and we're going to add a foreground layer. So back in the composition graph inspector, I'm going to click the plus icon once again, and I'm going to search for Texture 2D. There it is. I'm going to give it the name of foreground, and I'm going to drag it into the composition graph. Same as before, I'm going to right click in the empty space, and I'm going to choose Create Node, and I'm going to search for Sample Texture 2D. Beautiful. And I'm going to connect in exactly the same way as we did before. Now you may be noticing we have no available inputs by which we can add a third layer. Well, let me show you how this is done. We're going to add another LERP node. I'm going to disconnect the output by hovering my mouse over the line, right-clicking, and choosing Delete. In the empty space, I'm going to right-click, choose Create Node, and type LERP. LERP. Here we go. I'm going to send the output of our background and midground mixed together. We want to send that as a single input into the A input of our second LERP. And I bet you can guess I'm going to grab the RGBA of the foreground and connect it to the B input. And just as we did before, I want the transparent aspects of our foreground to allow for our background and midground to be visible. So I'm going to connect its alpha channel to the transparency of our new LERP. Going to move things over just so we can see things a little more clearly. Here in this graph setup, you can see that we have background. Oh, I'm moving things around. You can see we have background sent to lerp. We have midground sent to lerp. Our background and midground are now considered one. And we have that single output sent to a second lerp, which is also layered with our foreground information. And all of that is sent as a single output to our base color on our output. Hit Save Asset. We are finished with the default composition graph. Head on back by double-clicking the default composition graph to return to the workspace and open up the Graphics Compositor. Here in the layers, we can see that we have background, midground, and foreground. With Graphics Compositor set up and our background, midground, and foreground graphic compositor layers built, let's build a scene. Let's start assigning game objects to these individual layers and building a composition. This is the fun part. It's also the part to really pay close attention to. It's not overly complicated, but it's got little bits, you'll want to pay attention. So the first thing I'm going to do is drag my game window and place it over here above my inspector so that it is always present, always visible. The other thing I'm going to do for working in building a scene, I'm going to switch over to the scene view. And here in the hierarchy, we're going to create some game objects. So I'm going to right click in the hierarchy and choose 3D object and choose to create a cube. I'm going to give the cube a name of cube BG so that I know it will be assigned to the background. I can see in its inspector by looking at its transform that its position is way off center. I'm uncertain as to why. When you created this game object, it may have landed at 0, 0, 0. That should be the behavior. For whatever reason, it did not for me, so I will click on the 3 dots and choose reset. You can see that my position is now 0, 0, 0. You yourself may not need to make that step. Let's add another game object, and let's call this, we'll create a 3D object by right-clicking in the hierarchy and choosing a sphere this time around. And I will call this sphere sphere foreground. Again, way off center, so I'm going to click the 3 dots and choose Reset Transform. There we go. I'm going to position my viewport so that I'm looking directly at these items. And I'm going to drag the sphere slightly to the right. And I will drag the cube slightly to the left. Just so it's visually not in our way, I'm going to move my sky and fog volume mostly off canvas. And why don't I just go ahead and do the same with the directional light? Because we don't need to see them. Why have the visual clutter when we're focusing on other things? So there we are there. In our graphics compositor, we can see that the output for our main compositor camera is being sent to display 1. The reason I point this out is we have our main compositor camera, which I'm going to Command Shift F to align to the current viewport in the scene window. Graphics compositor output display, display 1. If I highlight the main compositor camera in the hierarchy, we can see in the inspector, under its camera component, the target display is display 1. These correspond with one another. They are one and the same. If I change it to 3, then I'll want this to be 3 as well. They are 1 by default. The reason I mention this is you can see that the main camera within our scene is also displaying on target display 1. Because they are sending their signals to the same output, they're going to fight one another. The main compositor camera will show us the composition that we are building. The main camera will only show us what it's looking at in the scene window. So we do not want any camera in our hierarchy to be on the same target display as our main compositor camera. Which means if main compositor camera is on target display 1, we want every other camera in our hierarchy to be on one of these other displays. So for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to place additional cameras in our hierarchy, and I'm going to assign them all to display 2. So let's do that together right now. First things first, we don't need a main camera. I could rename it and reassign its properties, true, but I want to build a camera from scratch so you can see what it is it's doing and why we are configuring it the way that we are. So I will delete the main camera. Obviously, we lose display here in our game view. In the hierarchy, I'm going to right-click and look for camera. There's camera, and I'm going to call this camera background. I'm also going to scroll down in its inspector and change its output from target display 1 to target display 2. Again, it's disappeared. That's fine by us. Camera background is going to look at, or render, I should say, only objects that we want on our background. So I'm also going to create a camera that looks at our foreground element. So I'm going to do that by right-clicking in the hierarchy once again, choosing camera, and giving it a name of foreground. And I'm going to make sure that our camera foreground has a target display of display 2. In our scene view, I'm going to make sure that both cameras are in the position of our scene view as we see it here and now. So I'm going to Command-Shift-F to align it to view. Same with the background. I'm going to Command-Shift-F the background camera. So now it's snapped. So every camera in our scene, which is our main compositor camera, our camera background, and our camera foreground, all three of them are right there. They're basically stacked on top of one another, as you can see as I move them out. I'm going to move them back into position, stacked on top of one another. I merely wanted you to see where I had pulled them in, and then to illustrate it as I did here. So Command Z those last two moves. There we go. I'm also going to align my current view with these cameras. There we are. Everything's lined up. So why is our game window completely dark? This is because the only camera currently rendering to display 1, you see that game window is currently showing us display 1. Our main compositor camera is display 1, so this is what we're seeing. And it's currently saying, hey, I see nothing, I see darkness. That's because all of our other cameras are on display 2. And we can see what they're looking at by changing game window to display 2. So, if we switch into Graphics Compositor, let's set it up so that we can see elements inside our display 1 game window. We're going to place cameras. Our background camera is going to go on background layer. Our foreground camera is going to go on foreground layer. In a moment, we will place a video via a video player on the midground. But let's go ahead and select our background. Let's add to the list with the plus button. We can add an image, a video, or a camera. You'll notice we cannot add a game object directly to one of our graphics compositor layers. We can only add these three options: image, video, camera. So we can use our camera to present a view of a game object, being that we can't add the game object directly. So on our background layer, I will add a camera, and you'll see that it adds a camera icon with a sublayer name of new sublayer. I'm going to name this new sublayer. I'm going to give it a meaningful name and call it camera background. We can see that the source camera, it automatically chose the wrong camera. It chose foreground. So we'll drag from the hierarchy and replace with our desired camera, which is camera background. Now, we also, while we're working with background, we can tell this camera which items to render, to show us. You can see that right off the bat, the background camera is showing us both our background cube and our foreground cube. That's not the behavior we desire. So how do we configure this? With our background camera selected, we can scroll down under Properties and see Culling Mask. We can turn Culling Mask on, and currently it's showing us everything in our scene. We can tell it to show us nothing, and you'll notice that in our game display window, everything disappeared. We see nothing. And if we choose everything, we see everything again. So how do we say, show us only a specific element, a specific game object? We do this through Unity layers. Unity layers are distinctly different from Graphics Compositor layers. Graphics Compositor layers we created in the default composition graph, and we see their representation in the Graphics Compositor. These are Graphics Compositor layers. They are different from Unity layers, which we find in the inspector, under layer, and then a list of every available layer. I can tell already that because I've made this tutorial once before, I created and then forgot to delete 3 layers that I hand built. You are not going to see background, midground, or foreground. They're not going to be there for you. I created those. I'm going to delete them, and I'm going to walk you through the step of creating them now. So with a game object selected, any game object, click on Layer, choose Add Layer, and I'm going to just delete the layers I added. This is what your list will look like fresh out of the box in your Unity project. You'll see that we have a lot of empty slots available for creating new layers. The means by which a new layer is created is very simple. It's simply giving it a name. So in an empty slot, I'll start with user layer 6. I'm just going to type the word background. Same for midground, just type midground. And in user layer 8, I'll just type foreground. That is all. With those names provided, we now have layers for those respected. We can now see that we have them right here. So let's assign our cube background game object from our hierarchy. With it selected, let's change the layer that the cube background game object is on from default to background. While we are at it, let's change our sphere foreground game object in the hierarchy. Let's move over to its inspector and change its layer from default to foreground. We can now look to our Graphics Compositor, Background, select our background camera, and with Culling Mask, we can tell the camera to render and display only game objects which are on our background layer. And now we can see that we are able to view our cube background, but it's not giving us our foreground. Perfect. That's what we want from our background camera. Let's do the same for our foreground sphere. So I'm swapping my layers around. Select the foreground layer in Graphics Compositor, choose Add to List, and choose Camera. You will see that you are given a new sublayer with a camera icon. Select that new sublayer, assign the appropriate camera. For us, it's camera foreground. Slot that in to the source camera. Oh, it's not wanting to play nicely. Hello. There may be something. For whatever reason, uncertain as to why, our camera foreground, when created, it has a transform and an audio listener, and it did not receive a camera component. I do not know why. While we are troubleshooting, I'm going to just clear these little arbitrary errors. So we can fix our camera one of two ways. We can either delete it and create a new camera, or we can select our camera, and in its inspector, I can search and add camera. Perfect. But this also means I need to go back into its target display and make sure that it is on display 2. Perfect. Now I can look at our foreground, select our new camera sublayer, and now with a camera component attached to our camera foreground, it should slot in just fine. Now, we want the camera foreground to use a culling mask, so we activate the culling mask, and we want it to show us nothing except for our foreground elements. We can see our sphere. Perfect. But why don't we see behind our sphere? Why do we not see our background and our background camera showing us a cube? This is because we also need to activate clear color with it set to color. And you'll notice that once this is activated, we see both game objects. We're actually, it looks like one view, but we're looking at the output of two cameras. We're looking at our foreground camera showing us a sphere, and we're looking through our background camera showing us our cube. On our midground, we want to put a live action video playing, or in our case, it's a pre-recorded video clip. So let's create and slot that in. In our hierarchy, let's right-click, choose Video, Video Player. I'm going to give this a name, a Video Player Midground, MG. And for pure organizational purposes, I'm going to drag the midground game object to sit in between the background and the foreground element. This has no effect. The order of your game objects in your hierarchy has no effect of how they are rendered in the Graphics Compositor. It's simply easy for me to locate items when we're working with them if I know that they exist in order from background, midground, foreground. That's the only reason. With our video player game object selected in our hierarchy, let us then move to its inspector and change its layer from default to midground. Let's also, in our video player, assign a video clip. So from our movies assets folder, double click. Let me select my video player once again, so it's here in our inspector. let's just drag our dinosaur clip into the video clip slot. When working with the Graphics Compositor, we do not need to worry about the render mode or the target texture. As soon as we add our video player to our Graphics Compositor, Graphics Compositor will take care of the rest for us. So, if you'll notice, let's select midground. With midground in Graphics Compositor highlighted, let's add to list and choose video. All right. For whatever reason, Unity is shuffling my things around when I create them. So I'm just going to drag them back to where they belong. I'm not entirely certain why that happens. Ghost in the machine. So with midground selected, we can see that we have a new sublayer with a video icon. Under layer name, under properties, we have layer name, video source. Drag our video player into the source video. And as I do this, I want you to notice that the render mode and target texture are automatically configured by Graphics Compositor as I slot it in. Right now, there is nothing. There's no render texture and it's unassigned. So when I drag video player into source video, you can see that render mode is changed from its default to camera near plane, and it's assigned to camera compositor layer 3. We didn't have to build anything or configure anything. It was done for us. So let's give our video player sublayer a meaningful name. I'm going to simply call it video player midground. Now, culling mask, we want to change from nothing to midground. We will see nothing in our game view because videos are not shown to us until we initialize them for the first time, which we do so with the play button. In order for us to see through our video green screen footage, in order for us to see what's behind it, we need to follow the same procedure we did with our foreground camera, which is to enable clear color by enabling the checkbox and making sure it's set to color. Let's go ahead and initialize so that we can see the video player in our game view. So I'm going to hit the play button. And there is our dinosaur. It did look like there was something funny with its scale time. You saw that it played really quickly. That might be something that may require a restart from me in order to get working. That's not a normal behavior, but let's continue going. If a restart is needed, I'll throw one in there. I'm going to activate loop so that our video continues to play. I'm going to change update mode from unscaled game time to, let's see if game time does anything for us. Let's see if it changes the behavior or if it still plays back very quickly. Okay, no, there's what it should be showing us all along. Let's switch back to unscaled game time, and I'm just curious if it goes back to playing fast or if it plays properly. It plays properly. Unscaled game time is honestly extremely useful and probably the preferred method for what you desire to utilize. Why it played back quickly in the first, right off the bat, I cannot say. Maybe it goes in the machine, maybe uncertain, but you saw that we were able to fix it simply by changing the update mode and then changing it back. So if you encounter some sort of bug like that, you might want to try something similar to what we just did. Let's keep going. We can see that we see our foreground sphere in front of our dinosaur, and we see that we have our dinosaur, but we definitely need to key out the green. So that's our next step. I'm going to stop. We need to add filters. So select your video player midground layer, sublayer. Scroll down under properties to find input filters. We're going to add to the list using the plus icon, and we're going to add chroma keying. Probably the quickest way to add the appropriate key color is to select the eyedropper and to select the color from your project window. And we now have the appropriate green slotted in. We may need to adjust our key threshold and our key tolerance, but we need to do that from within the play mode because we need our video to be initialized so that we can see what it is we're doing here in the game window. So I'm going to enter play mode. There's our video. I'm going to once again select the video player midground. It looks like I don't need to touch either of these key threshold or key tolerance parameters. Obviously, I'm not zoomed in closely. I'm looking in a small window, but that looks like a good key. If you don't have a great key, you can mess with these numbers to dial in the key as you need to. It all depends on the source footage you're working with. So I'll hit Command Z to go back to the default. So I'm going to slide over to my scene view, and I'm going to, in my hierarchy, select cube background. And you can see that the cube is here, I'm moving it, and it appears behind our video plate. We can now build a 3D scene with depth, with lighting, with all the lovely production tools at our disposal, and we can create a world that exists behind our green screen camera feed or pre-recorded footage. And you'll see that if I select my sphere foreground, that it exists 100% in front of our live camera feed or pre-recorded green screen footage. Graphics Compositor is a very powerful and very useful tool. It is not without its downsides, its shortcomings, in comparison to placing video on 3D geometry such as a plane or a quad positioned within 3D space within your 3D scene. For instance, Graphics Compositor, when displaying a video such as our video player midground, the video player cannot receive shadows from geometry within your 3D world, nor can your video feed or pre-recorded footage receive light from your virtual lights within your 3D world. When working with Graphics Compositor, you will need to use real-world cinema lights to light your subjects to match the lighting inside of your 3D virtual world. You'll have to create your shadows in real time, in real world, and you'll have to create your lighting in the real world. This is in juxtaposition with placing your video on 3D geometry, and let me illustrate this. So here in our game world, you can see there is no shadow created by our moving dinosaur on our midground Graphics Compositor layer. I'm going to stop playback. I'm going to enter our scene view, and I'm going to rotate the camera around a little bit and activate some game objects that I created off screen. They consist of a floor and a plane. You can see that I have a large video plane, and I have already scaled it to be 1.77 on the x-axis. That is that equates to 16 by 9. And you can see that this game object, because it's in the 3D space, it casts a shadow. I've assigned a second video player to display a video onto this game object itself. We'll see the effect when I start playback mode. We will now see a dinosaur that casts a living shadow as it moves. So if I select my game object, sun, directional light, notice that as I move this light around in 3D space, the dinosaur that is on the 3D object responds with shadow and brightness or darkness. So when the sun is behind the video, the face of the dinosaur is dark and the shadow is front. But when we look over here at the Graphics Compositor dinosaur, it does not respond the same. There is no shadow, there is no darkness on the front. So if you want a very easy, very integrated live action or pre-recorded footage inside of a 3D world, the easiest route for a really strong integration is to have it respond to light inside of your 3D world and also create shadows. So placing video on a 3D object such as a quad or a plane is a simpler and more effective workflow. Graphics Compositor is really beautiful when you want to set up your stage, and let's say you have on your green screen stage a set of green screen steps in the background, and you want your live action actor to descend the real steps in the background of the scene and walk forward to the foreground of your composite. Well, if you have green screen steps and you have corresponding adequately positioned virtual steps inside of your 3D world, and if they line up properly, then with Graphics Compositor, you can have your character walking down your virtual steps and then crossing stage and walking down stage and walking up stage again and moving about. And it looks like they're truly in that world, but you need to have that lighting and shadow also present on your green screen stage. When working with a plane, you don't have to worry as much about the real world green screen stage lighting because you can always relight to great effect. And obviously your shadows are generated in engine as opposed to needing to be created on the green screen stage. The downside, of course, with placing a video on a plane as opposed to Graphics Compositor is your plane is going to exist wherever you place it. It's much more difficult. It's really great for stationary characters. If they're going to live here and you're just going to do a sweeping camera move, that's perfect. But placing a placing a character on a 3D plane and wanting them to walk from the back, from upstage toward camera downstage, that's trickier. That's more suited for Graphics Compositor. You can fake it with keyframes, you can fake it with animations, but you might have problems where the feet meet the ground. So you might find yourself composing in a manner to hide those contact points. You've been given a very comprehensive overview of Graphics Compositor, how to set it up, how to work with it, what the workflow is. And I've also shown you here at the end what its downsides are and how it differs from using a 3D game object such as a quad or a plane and placing your video within 3D space inside of your environment. And you've also hopefully gained an idea of when each strategy, whether it's placing video in 3D space or using Graphics Compositor, will work for you and your desired outcome. They say you learn once when you learn it yourself and a second time when you teach it to someone else. In that vein, I hope we both benefited here today. Thank you for watching. Again, like and subscribe if you don't mind. I appreciate you. See you in the next video.